In 1995, two researchers named Thomas Berger and Erich Trinkaus did something nobody had ever tried before. They took every Neanderthal skeleton that had been found up to that point and catalogued every single injury. Broken arms, fractured skulls, shattered ribs, crushed vertebrae. Then they compared those injuries to every modern injury database they could find. Hospital records, military records, sports records, industrial accidents. And the closest match they found was not soldiers, not construction workers, not boxers. The closest match was professional rodeo cowboys, bull riders and bronc busters, the only people alive today who routinely get that close to large angry animals that are actively trying to hurt them. And when I say closest match, I mean the pattern was almost identical. The types of fractures, the locations on the body, the frequency of head and upper body trauma, even the ratio of healed injuries to fatal ones. If you shuffled Neanderthal x-rays in with rodeo rider x-rays and asked an orthopedic surgeon to sort them, they would struggle to tell the difference. That is how specific the match was, and that is how dangerous Neanderthal daily life was. Not occasionally dangerous, not sometimes risky. Consistently, relentlessly, career-endingly dangerous in the same way that riding a 2,000-pound bull is dangerous, except that rodeo riders do it for 8 seconds at a time and then climb over a fence. Neanderthals did it for hours in open terrain with no fence to climb over and no medical team waiting on the other side. Except rodeo cowboys have helmets, padding, arena walls, and paramedics standing by. Neanderthals had a wooden stick, and tonight we are going to talk about how they did it, how a species of human survived for over 300,000 years by walking up to woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, and wild aurochs, and stabbing them at arm's length with handheld thrusting spears. No bows, no throwing, no distance. Face to face, close enough to smell the animal's breath. And here is the part that really gets me. We are going to get to this later, but I want you to know it now because it changes how you hear everything else. When those hunters got injured, and they got injured constantly, the group took care of them. We have found Neanderthal skeletons with healed injuries so severe that the person could not have survived alone for a single week. Broken legs that healed straight. Crushed eye sockets that healed over. One individual at a site called Shanidar Cave had a withered arm, was blind in one eye and was partially deaf, and he lived for years like that. They carried him, they fed him, they kept him alive. These were not mindless brutes. These were people, and their hunting tells you more about who they were than almost anything else we have found. So settle in tonight, get comfortable. This is a long one and it is one of my favourites, because the deeper you go into Neanderthal hunting, the more incredible it gets. Now before we talk about how they hunted, you need to understand why they had to hunt in the first place. And the answer is not just hunger, it is physics, it is biology, it is the raw mathematics of staying alive in an ice age. A Neanderthal body was built differently from yours. They were shorter than us on average, maybe 5'4" or 5'5", but they were built like tanks, barrel chests, thick limbs, dense, heavy bones, wide hips, massive muscle attachments. If you saw one standing next to a modern human, the difference would be obvious immediately. They were stocky and powerful in a way that no living person is. And that body, that incredible muscular frame, burned fuel at an extraordinary rate. Researchers have estimated that a Neanderthal male needed somewhere between 4,000 and 5,500 calories every single day just to function. Not to run, not to fight, just to exist, just to keep that body warm in the freezing temperatures of Ice Age Europe, and to power those enormous muscles. To put that in perspective for you, the average modern person needs about 2,000 calories a day. A Neanderthal needed double that, sometimes more. And here is the thing, there were no crops, no farming, no grain storage, no orcharding, nothing. The only reliable way to get that many calories in an Ice Age environment was meat. Large quantities of meat, from large animals taken down at close range. That is not a lifestyle choice, that is survival math. And it meant that Neanderthals were not casual hunters. They were obligate predators. Hunting was not something they did sometimes when they felt like it. It was the central activity of their entire existence. Every single day revolved around it. Where to find animals, how to approach them, when to strike, how to process the kill, how to carry the meat back, how to distribute it among the group. Everything, and I mean everything in a Neanderthal's world, connected back to the hunt. And the animals they were hunting were unlike anything alive today. I want you to picture the world they lived in, because it was a different planet. Not literally, of course, but the landscape and the creatures on it would be almost unrecognizable to you. This was Pleistocene Europe, the Ice Age world, and it was home to some of the largest, most powerful animals that have ever existed on land. The woolly mammoth, 13 feet tall at the shoulder, weighing between 6 and 8 tons, covered in thick reddish-brown hair, enormous curved tusks that could be 15 feet long. You've seen pictures of elephants. Imagine one a third larger, covered in fur with tusks the size of a car, standing in a snowfield. That is what Neanderthals were hunting, and it gets more intense from there. The woolly rhinoceros, 4,000 pounds, covered in a thick coat of hair, a massive horn on its nose made of compacted keratin, which is the same stuff your fingernails are made of. Aggressive, territorial, fast over short distances despite its size. If you charged one, it charged back. And unlike the mammoth, which was at least somewhat social and predictable, the woolly rhinoceros was solitary and unpredictable. It could turn on you in a heartbeat. Then there was the steppe bison, bigger than any modern bison. Think of an American buffalo, then add about 30% more mass, horns that could span 3 feet from tip to tip, incredibly strong, incredibly fast, could kick hard enough to shatter bone, and they travelled in herds, which meant you were never facing just one. You were facing dozens, sometimes hundreds, and you had to figure out how to separate one from the group without getting trampled by the rest. Wild horses, aurochs, which were the ancestors of modern cattle but massive, standing 6 feet tall at the shoulder with horns that pointed forward, giant deer with antlers spanning 12 feet across, reindeer that migrated in enormous herds across the tundra. That was the menu. That was what Neanderthals had to bring down with stone-tipped spears and their bare hands. Coming up, we are going to get into the weapons they made, and that is where this story starts to blow your mind. Because the spears they built were not crude, they were engineered, they were precise. And at one site in Germany, archaeologists found a set of spears so well made that they could have been thrown in a modern javelin competition. We will get there. But first, let me tell you about caloric math, because it puts the whole thing in perspective. If you are using this to wind down tonight, that is literally why I make these. Maybe hit subscribe if you have not already. I love seeing the comments in the morning about where everyone is listening from. All right, back to it. So a Neanderthal group, we're talking maybe 15 to 25 individuals, men, women, children, elderly. All of them need to eat. All of them are burning enormous amounts of energy every day just staying warm. A group of 20 Neanderthals would need somewhere between 60 and 80,000 calories per day, collectively. Every day. No days off, no supply chain, no refrigeration, no trade networks, just what they could find, kill and carry back to camp. And to get that many calories reliably, they could not hunt small game. Rabbits, birds, small deer, those things are fine as supplements, but they do not move the needle when you need 80,000 calories a day for your group. You need large animals, megafauna, the big ones, the dangerous ones. One adult horse could provide upward of 200,000 calories. A bison, maybe 300,000. A mammoth, millions. One successful mammoth hunt could feed a group for weeks. That is the logic. That is the cold, mathematical reason why Neanderthals consistently hunted the largest, most dangerous animals in their environment. It was not because they were reckless. It was not because they were stupid. It was because it was the most efficient survival strategy available to them. The big animals had the calories they needed and they had the skill to bring them down. Simple as that. But bringing them down required something extraordinary, and this is where we get into the weapons. In 1994, near a town called Schoningen in northern Germany, an archaeologist named Hartmut Thiemer was excavating an old open-pit coal mine when he found something that changed everything we thought we knew about early humans. Buried in ancient lakeside sediments, preserved by waterlogged soil for 300,000 years, were 8 wooden spears. Perfect wooden spears. Let me describe them to you, because these are not what most people picture when they think of caveman weapons. Each spear was between 6 and 8 feet long. They were made from spruce trees, and they were made from the hardest part of the tree, the base of the trunk where the wood is densest and strongest. The tips were carefully shaped and hardened, probably by fire. But here is the remarkable part. The weight distribution on these spears is almost identical to modern competition javelins. The centre of gravity is shifted forward toward the tip, which is exactly how you design a weapon for accurate throwing or for maximum penetration during a thrust. These were not random sticks someone sharpened. These were designed. Someone, 300,000 years ago, understood the physics of how a spear moves through the air and through flesh, and they built their weapons accordingly. And here is what makes that even more impressive. There is an ongoing debate about whether these spears were thrown or thrust. Some researchers think they were throwing javelins, which would mean Neanderthals, or their ancestors, had distance hunting capabilities far earlier than anyone suspected. Others think they were thrusting spears designed for close-range combat with large animals. Either way, the craftsmanship is staggering. These were made by people who knew exactly what they were doing, and we are talking about 300,000 years ago. That is before Homo sapiens even existed as a species. Let that sit with you for a second. Before our species even appeared on this planet, someone was already making precision-engineered hunting weapons on the shores of a lake in Germany. But the spears are only half the story, because Neanderthals did not just shape wood. They also made some of the most sophisticated stone tools in all of prehistory. And here is where it gets really technical and really beautiful at the same time. The main technique they used is called the Levallois method, named after a suburb of Paris where these distinctive stone flakes were first identified back in the 1800s. And if you have never heard of this, it is going to change what you think about Neanderthal intelligence. The Levallois method is not about picking up a rock and smashing it until you get a sharp edge. It is a multi-step planned process. You start with a piece of flint or chert, a type of hard, fine-grained stone that fractures predictably. First, you carefully shape the outside of the stone into a specific form, almost like sculpting. You create a domed surface on one side, a preparation surface. Then, with one precise strike in exactly the right spot, you detach a single flake from that prepared core, and that flake comes off with a predetermined shape. You decided what shape the final tool would be before you even struck the blow. Think about that. You are holding a rock, and you are working backward from the tool you want, shaping the core so that when you finally strike it, the piece that comes off is already the right shape. That requires visualization, planning, understanding of fracture mechanics, patience, motor control. You cannot do this by accident. You cannot do this without teaching. This is learned, practiced, refined skill that was passed from generation to generation. Some researchers have compared the cognitive demands of Levallois tool-making to playing chess or doing multi-step mathematical proofs. It requires holding a mental template of the finished product while performing a sequence of steps in the correct order, knowing that one mistake at step 3 could ruin the entire process at step 12. And Neanderthals did not just use this technique occasionally, it was their standard approach. Every hunting group across all of Europe and Western Asia, from Spain to Siberia, used variations of the Levallois method. For over 200,000 years, it was their technology, and it worked beautifully. The flakes produced by this method are thin, razor-sharp, and remarkably uniform. They could be used as cutting tools on their own, or they could be hafted onto spears, attached to a wooden shaft to create a composite weapon. And that brings us to the next part of this story, which I think is one of the most underappreciated discoveries in all of archaeology. Neanderthals invented glue. Not just any glue, they invented the oldest adhesive substance ever created by any human species. It is called birch bark tar, and it is roughly 200,000 years old. Here is how they made it. They would take strips of birch bark and heat them in a controlled way, in the absence of oxygen. That is important. You cannot just throw bark on a fire and get tar. You need to heat it without letting it burn. That requires either burying the bark in a pit beneath a fire or using some kind of sealed container made of clay or stone. The bark slowly breaks down under heat and produces a thick, dark, sticky substance, birch bark tar. And this tar, once cooled, is a powerful adhesive. It sets hard, it is waterproof, it can be reheated and reshaped, and it was used to attach stone points to wooden spear shafts, creating a composite tool that was stronger and more deadly than either material alone. Now stop and think about the chemistry here. To make birch bark tar, you need to control temperature very precisely. Too hot, and the bark just burns to ash. Not hot enough, and the chemical breakdown does not happen. You need sustained, controlled heat in an oxygen-limited environment. That is not simple. That is not obvious. That is a multi-step chemical process that someone had to discover, refine, and then teach to others. Some experimental archaeologists have tried to replicate this process, and it is genuinely difficult. It takes practice, attention, and knowledge that could only come from experience. One team found that the most reliable method involves digging a small pit, filling it with birch bark rolls, sealing the top with clay, and then building a fire directly on top. After several hours, the tar collects in the bottom of the pit. It works, but it is not intuitive. Someone, 200,000 years ago, figured this out, and then their children learned it, and their children's children, and on for thousands of generations. That is a tradition. That is culture. That is knowledge being passed forward through time. So when you put the whole toolkit together, here is what a Neanderthal hunting group was carrying into the field. Long wooden spears made from dense spruce, with fire-hardened tips, or stone points hafted on with birch bark tar. Levallois stone flakes in various sizes for cutting, scraping and processing. Probably some kind of carrying bags or wraps made of animal hide. And they had the knowledge, the skill, and the teamwork to use all of it against the biggest animals on the continent. That is not primitive. That is a military operation. And now, let us talk about how they actually carried it out. How did they actually bring these animals down? Because the hunting itself, the actual method, is where you really start to appreciate what Neanderthals were capable of. And it starts with something that does not sound very exciting, but was absolutely essential. They watched. Before anything else happened, before any spear was raised, there was observation, patience, intelligence gathering. Neanderthals lived in the same landscapes as their prey year-round, often for generations. They knew those landscapes intimately. They knew where the rivers narrowed, where the gorges formed natural dead ends, where the ground was soft and would slow a heavy animal, where the wind usually blew from, which mattered because large animals have an incredible sense of smell, and if they caught your scent from half a mile away, the hunt was over before it started. This was not random wandering followed by impulsive attacks. This was strategic, planned, calculated predation by people who understood animal behaviour as well as any modern wildlife biologist. There is a concept in archaeology called landscape knowledge, and Neanderthals are the best example of it in all of human prehistory. They did not just live in a place, they read it, they understood it, they used the terrain itself as a weapon. And we know this because of the patterns we find at kill sites. Take a site called Mauran, in the French Pyrenees. At Mauran, archaeologists have found the remains of at least 137 bison, all concentrated at the base of a natural cliff. 137. That is not a single hunt. That is a killing ground that was used over and over again, across many years, possibly many decades. The Neanderthals in this area figured out that they could drive bison toward this cliff face, corner them, and then move in for the kill. They used the same spot repeatedly because it worked. Because the landscape gave them an advantage, and they knew it. And this tells us something crucial. They were not just reacting to opportunities, they were engineering them. They were choosing where to hunt based on tactical advantages, the same way a general chooses where to fight a battle. You pick terrain that helps you and hurts your enemy. That is exactly what Neanderthals did. And they passed that knowledge down. One generation taught the next where the good killing grounds were, which valleys funneled animals into dead ends, which streams slowed bison enough to close the distance. This is cultural knowledge. This is tradition. This is strategy being inherited across time. Coming up, I'm going to tell you about a spear that was found between the ribs of an ancient elephant, and what that single find tells us about the reality of close-range hunting. But first, let me paint the picture of what an actual hunt looked like, step by step, based on what the evidence tells us. Imagine a group of maybe 8 to 12 hunters, and yes, recent research suggests that Neanderthal women may have hunted alongside men, which makes sense when you think about it, because every adult was needed for a group that small to function. They have been tracking a herd of steppe bison for 2 days, not chasing, tracking, following at a distance, staying downwind, reading the signs, hoof prints in soft earth, fresh droppings, grass that has been grazed recently. They know this herd. Some of them have probably hunted this same herd before, or their parents did. They know where the herd is headed because they know the migration patterns, and they know there is a narrow valley ahead, a place where the hillsides close in and the ground gets rocky and broken, a place where a big animal cannot run at full speed, a place where a human with a spear has a chance. So they get ahead of the herd. They split into 2 groups, some circle wide to the far side of the valley to act as blockers, Others position themselves along the sides, hidden behind rocks and brush, and they wait. This might take hours. Patient, silent, controlled. These are people who can sit motionless in freezing cold for as long as it takes. And then the herd enters the valley. The blockers on the far end show themselves, maybe making noise, waving, throwing stones. The bison at the front of the herd stop, confused. The ones behind keep pushing forward. The herd compresses. Animals start to panic. And in that moment of chaos, the hunters on the flanks move in. They do not charge. They approach carefully, spears held low, picking their targets. They are looking for an animal that has been separated from the main group, one that is confused or cornered. They close the distance to just a few yards, and then they thrust, hard, with both hands driving a heavy wooden spear into the animal's side, aiming for the rib cage, for the lungs and heart. And the animal does not just fall over. A steppe bison that has been speared does not politely lie down. It thrashes, it kicks, it tries to run. It might turn and try to gore the hunter who just hurt it. This is the most dangerous moment. The moment after the first spear goes in, when the animal is hurt and terrified and fighting for its life. Other hunters move in, more spears, from the sides, from behind. They are working together, communicating, watching each other's positions, and slowly, with multiple spear thrusts and enormous physical effort, the animal goes down. That is what Neanderthal hunting looked like. Up close, physical, violent, terrifyingly dangerous, and they did it over and over and over again for 300,000 years. Now, I mentioned a spear found between elephant ribs. Let me tell you about that, because it is one of the most vivid pieces of evidence we have. In 1948, near a town called Lehringen in northern Germany, workers draining a peat bog found the skeleton of a straight-tusked elephant, and lodged between its ribs, right where the heart and lungs would have been, was a wooden spear. A yew wood spear about 7.5 feet long, thrust into the animal with such force that it penetrated between the ribs and stayed there as the animal died, and the body was buried in sediment and preserved for 120,000 years. Think about what that means. Someone, a Neanderthal, stood close enough to an elephant, an animal that weighed several tons, and drove a spear between its ribs with enough force to puncture deep into the chest cavity. That is arm's length. That is so close that the elephant could have reached the hunter with its trunk. That is so close that if the animal had turned or stumbled, the hunter would have been crushed, and they did it anyway. Now let me give you a sense of what that moment was like. The straight-tusked elephant, Paleoloxodon antiquus, was even bigger than a woolly mammoth. Some individuals weighed over 10 tons. 10 tons. That is the weight of a large school bus. Standing next to one, a Neanderthal hunter would have been looking at a wall of muscle and skin that towered over them by 6 or 7 feet. The legs alone were thicker than the hunter's entire body. The feet were wide, flat, heavy enough to crush a person into the ground without the animal even noticing. And this hunter, this individual Neanderthal, closed the distance, got within arm's length, braced their body, and drove a 7.5-foot yew wood spear between the ribs with enough force to penetrate deep into the chest cavity, past the thick hide, past the subcutaneous fat layer, past the intercostal muscles, and into the space where the heart and lungs sat. That is not a casual poke. That is a full-body committed thrust by someone who understood exactly where to aim and how much force was needed to reach the vital organs. They had done this before. They knew the anatomy, they knew the angle, and they knew the risk, because at the moment of that thrust they were close enough to be killed instantly by a reflexive swing of the trunk or a step of one of those enormous feet. That single find at Lehringen tells you more about Neanderthal courage, skill and physical capability than 1,000 textbooks. It is proof of close-range, high-risk, face-to-face combat with one of the largest animals walking the earth, and it is not an isolated case. At multiple sites across Europe we find evidence of the same pattern. Close-range hunting of megafauna, spear tips lodged in bone, stone tools with impact fractures from being driven hard into animal flesh, cut marks on bones that show systematic, skilled butchering. This was the norm, not the exception. This was how Neanderthals lived. Every successful hunt meant survival. Every failed hunt meant starvation. And the hunters themselves paid a tremendous physical price for this lifestyle, which brings us back to where we started tonight. Those rodeo rider injuries. Let me walk you through what we actually find when we look at Neanderthal skeletons, because it tells a story of almost unimaginable toughness. Start with the head. Multiple Neanderthal skulls show healed fractures, impacts to the front and sides of the head that cracked bone but did not kill. These are the kinds of injuries you get when a large animal swings its head or kicks and catches you across the face. One specimen from a site called Saint-Césaire in France has a healed cut across the top of the skull that went all the way through the outer layer of bone. That individual survived a hit to the head that exposed the inner skull, and lived, and healed. Move down to the arms. Fractured forearms are extremely common in Neanderthal remains. These are classic defense injuries, the kind you get when you throw your arms up to protect yourself from something coming at you. Also common are shoulder dislocations and fractures of the collarbone, which happen when you absorb a massive impact from the front or side. Ribs. Broken ribs are everywhere in the Neanderthal fossil record, and ribs do not just break from a gentle bump. It takes serious force to fracture a rib, especially Neanderthal ribs, which were thicker and more robust than ours. These are injuries from being kicked, charged, thrown, or crushed against hard ground by a large animal. Legs, hip injuries, knee damage, ankle fractures, all consistent with being knocked down, stepped on, or caught by a falling or charging animal. And here is the critical thing. Almost all of these injuries are healed. The bone grew back together, the fractures mended, the dislocations were reduced, which means that after the injury happened, that individual survived. They were carried back to camp. They were fed and cared for while they could not hunt. The group absorbed the loss of a productive hunter and kept that person alive through weeks or months of recovery. That is the part that gets me every time. The injuries tell you how dangerous the hunting was. The healing tells you how much they cared about each other. Both things are true simultaneously, and you cannot separate them. And now I want to talk about the individual cases, because the statistics are powerful, but the individual stories are what make this real. There is a Neanderthal known to researchers as Shanidar 1, or sometimes called Nandi. He was found in Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq, and his skeleton is one of the most studied in all of paleoanthropology. Nandi was an adult male, and the list of his injuries is staggering. He had a crushing fracture of the left eye socket that almost certainly left him blind on that side. He had a withered right arm that had been damaged so severely, probably from a fracture or dislocation, that the bone never grew back to full size. The arm was essentially useless. He had damage to his right leg that would have given him a severe limp. He had healed rib fractures, and he had changes in his inner ear bones that suggest he was partially deaf. This man could not hunt. He could not even walk without difficulty. He certainly could not defend himself from a charging animal, and yet he lived into his 40s, which was old age for a Neanderthal. He lived for years, possibly decades, with all of these disabilities. That is only possible if the people around him fed him, protected him, helped him move, and valued his life even when he could no longer contribute to the hunt. Think about what that means for a group of 20 people who need 80,000 calories a day. Every mouth you feed that cannot help bring in food makes life harder for everyone else. And they did it anyway. They kept Nandi alive. Why? We do not know exactly. Maybe he had knowledge they valued. Maybe he told stories. Maybe he had been a great hunter before his injuries, and they owed him a debt. Or maybe they just loved him. Maybe that is enough. Maybe that has always been enough. Coming up, we are going to talk about how they processed a kill, because that story is just as fascinating as the hunt itself. But I want to stay with the injuries for another moment, because there is one more pattern that is really interesting. When Berger and Trinkaus published that rodeo rider comparison in 1995, they noted something specific. The Neanderthal injuries were concentrated on the head, neck, and upper body, not the lower body, not the hands, the head and torso. That particular pattern matches what you see in people who are dealing with large animals at very close range. If you're far away from the animal, throwing projectiles, your injury pattern is different. You might get hurt running away or tripping on uneven ground. But the injuries would be more evenly distributed. The Neanderthal pattern, heavily concentrated in the upper body, tells us that they were right there, in the zone, close enough to be struck by a thrashing head or a kicking leg, close enough that the animal could reach their face and chest but not their lower body, because they were leaning in, driving a spear forward, putting their weight behind the thrust. That body position, leaning forward, arms extended, face exposed, is exactly what you would expect from someone using a thrusting spear against a large animal at close range. The injuries are a map of how they hunted. You can literally read the hunting technique from the bones, and it is the same pattern across the entire Neanderthal range, from Spain to the mountains of Central Asia. This was not a regional technique. This was the Neanderthal way. Close range, high risk, cooperative hunting of megafauna. Everywhere they lived. For hundreds of thousands of years. Now. Let us talk about what happened after the kill, because the hunt was only half the work. When a large animal went down, the work was really just beginning. And this is a part of the story that most people never think about, but it was just as important as the hunt itself. You have a steppe bison on the ground. 2,000 pounds of animal. You're miles from your camp, probably in a narrow valley or at the base of a cliff. You have stone tools and your bare hands, and you need to transform that animal into food, materials and supplies that your entire group can use, and you need to do it before predators show up. Because you were not the only predator in Ice Age Europe. There were cave hyenas, cave lions, wolves, bears, all of them attracted to the scent of a fresh kill. So speed mattered. The first step was opening the hide. Neanderthals used their Levallois flakes for this, those thin, razor-sharp stone tools we talked about earlier. They made long cuts along the belly and legs, peeling the skin back to expose the meat beneath. And we know how they did this because of something called cut marks. When a stone tool slices against bone during butchering, it leaves distinctive scratches on the bone surface. These cut marks have been found on thousands of animal bones at Neanderthal sites, and they follow consistent patterns. Marks on the limb bones where meat was stripped, marks on the joints where tendons were cut to separate legs from the body, marks on ribs where meat was filleted off the chest. The patterns are systematic and efficient. These were not random hacks. This was practiced, skilled butchery by people who had done it hundreds of times before and who knew exactly where to cut, how deep to go, and how to work around joints and tendons with minimum effort and maximum yield. And different group members probably had different roles. Some cutting meat, some processing bones, some watching for predators, some preparing hides. It was organised, coordinated work. After the major cuts of meat were removed, they went for the marrow. And this is where things get really interesting, because marrow was an incredibly valuable food source. Long bones, the femurs, tibius, humeri, are hollow tubes filled with fatty, calorie-dense marrow. To get at it, Neanderthals would take a heavy stone, a hammerstone, and crack the bone open with a precise strike. Not just smashing randomly. They hit the bone at specific points where it would fracture cleanly, opening the marrow cavity without shattering the bone into useless fragments. Archaeological sites are filled with these spirally fractured long bones, thousands and thousands of them, all broken in the same way, all with the marrow cavity scraped clean. Every single calorie was extracted, nothing was wasted, absolutely nothing. At some sites, even the smallest bone fragments show evidence of having been cracked and scraped for their marrow content. Phalanges, the small bones of the feet and toes, were split open even though they contained only a tiny amount of marrow. That level of thoroughness tells you something about how precious every calorie was. These were not people with the luxury of waste. Every hunt was bought with risk and effort and physical pain, and the returns from that hunt were consumed down to the last drop of fat and the last sliver of tendon. And beyond the meat and marrow, the animal provided other essential materials. The hide was critical. Animal skins were their clothing, their bedding, their wind protection, their carrying bags. Processing a hide into something usable required scraping off every bit of fat and flesh from the inner surface using stone scrapers, then probably working the hide with their hands to soften it. This is hard physical labour. Hours and hours of scraping and working until the skin was pliable enough to use. Tendons were saved too. Animal sinews are nature's string. Strong, flexible and durable, used for binding, tying, lashing stone points to spear shafts. Bones themselves were sometimes used as tools, shaped into points or hammers. The entire animal was used. Everything. When Neanderthals finished processing a large kill, there was almost nothing left, and then they had to carry it all back to camp. Now let us talk about something that does not get nearly enough attention when people discuss Neanderthal hunting. The logistics, the carrying. Because this is where you really start to appreciate what a complete system they had developed. A fully processed bison might yield 400 to 500 pounds of usable meat, fat, marrow and other materials, Your camp might be 2 miles away, 5 miles, maybe more, and there are no pack animals, no carts, no roads, just rough, uneven terrain, often covered in snow or mud. So how do you move it? The answer is you carry it, on your back, in bundles wrapped in fresh hide. Trip after trip after trip if necessary. And remember, these are people who are already exhausted from the hunt itself and the hours of butchering that followed. They're carrying hundreds of pounds of meat across difficult terrain, while also staying alert for predators who would love nothing more than to take that kill from them. This is endurance. This is physical capability on a level that most modern humans cannot even imagine. Studies of Neanderthal leg bones show enormous attachment points for muscles and ligaments, thickened shafts and stress markers that indicate they spent their entire lives carrying heavy loads over rough ground. Their bodies were literally shaped by this work, and when they finally got the meat back to camp, the work continued. The meat needed to be distributed. In a group of 20, distribution matters. Who gets what? How much goes to the hunters? How much goes to the children and elderly who stayed behind? How much is eaten now versus dried or stored for later? We do not know the exact social rules Neanderthals followed, but we know from studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies that meat sharing is one of the most important social activities in any group. It builds bonds, it creates obligations, it maintains trust. And in a group where your survival depends completely on the people around you, those social bonds were everything. I want to come back to something I mentioned earlier, because it is so important and so often overlooked. The question of whether Neanderthal women hunted. For a long time, the default assumption was that hunting was an exclusively male activity. Men hunted, women gathered. That was the story. But recent research has started to challenge this pretty seriously. Several lines of evidence suggest that in Neanderthal groups, the division of labour was not as sharp as it was in later Homo sapiens populations. First, there is the injury evidence. Female Neanderthal skeletons show the same kinds of traumatic injuries as males, the same upper body fractures, the same healed impacts. If women were staying safely at camp while men did all the dangerous work, you would expect their injury patterns to be very different. They are not. Second, there is the dental evidence. Neanderthal women's teeth show the same heavy wear patterns as men's teeth, including the distinctive front tooth wear that comes from using teeth as a third hand to grip materials like holding one end of a hide while cutting with the other hand, or gripping sinew while binding a spear point. This suggests that women were doing the same physical tasks as men, including hunt-related activities. Third, there is a simple mathematical argument. In a group of 20 people, maybe half are adults of hunting age. If only the males hunt, you have 5 to 7 hunters supporting 20 mouths. That is an incredibly thin margin. One injury, one failed hunt, one bad week of weather, and the whole group is in trouble. But if all adults hunt, male and female, you have 10 to 14 hunters. That doubles your chances of success and gives you a buffer against bad luck. In an Ice Age environment where there is no backup food source, that buffer might be the difference between survival and extinction. So the current thinking is that Neanderthal women probably did participate in hunting, at least some of the time. Maybe not every hunt, maybe not in every role, but they were not sitting at camp doing nothing while the men risked their lives. They were part of the system, part of the team, and the evidence is right there in their bones. Now let me tell you about one specific kind of hunt that I think is the most incredible of all, the mammoth hunt. Because when you sit down and actually think about how a group of humans with wooden spears could kill a woolly mammoth, your brain almost rejects it. The animal is 13 feet tall, it weighs 7 tons, its skull is so thick that no spear could penetrate it. Its tusks are 15 feet long and can sweep a person off their feet like a twig. It is intelligent, it has a long memory, and if it has encountered hunters before, it knows what they are. So how do you do it? You cannot charge a mammoth head-on. That is suicide. You cannot surround it easily because a mammoth in open terrain can simply walk through any circle of humans. You are ants to it. So you have to use the environment. You have to find a place where the mammoth is vulnerable, near a bog or swampy area where its enormous weight works against it, and it sinks into soft ground, near a steep bank or cliff edge, at a river crossing where the water slows it down and limits its mobility. And you have to wait for the right moment. A mammoth that is stuck in mud, or swimming across a river, or climbing a steep bank with its back legs struggling for traction, that is a mammoth you can approach. And then multiple hunters, from multiple directions, drive spears into the softest areas they can reach, the belly, behind the front legs, the underside of the trunk, the groin area, places where the skin is thinner and a spear can reach the organs beneath. And it takes time. A mammoth does not go down quickly. Even with multiple spear strikes, the animal might fight and struggle for hours. It is a horrifying, exhausting, extraordinarily dangerous process. And sometimes it failed. Sometimes the mammoth freed itself and escaped. Sometimes it turned and injured or hurt the hunters. But when it worked, when a mammoth finally went down, the reward was staggering. Millions of calories, enough meat to feed a group for a month or more, tusks that could be shaped into tools or used as structural supports, bones that could be used for building shelters, which is exactly what we find at some Eastern European sites where Neanderthals and later humans used mammoth bones as the structural framework for their dwellings. Enormous leg bones driven vertically into the ground as posts. Scapulae, the broad flat shoulder blades used as roofing panels, overlapping like shingles to shed rain and snow. Jaws stacked in arcs to form walls. Tusks bent and lashed together to create the curved framework of a dome. These mammoth bone structures are among the most remarkable architectural achievements of the Ice Age, built entirely from the body of a single species of prey. Some of these structures use the bones of dozens of individual mammoths, accumulated over many hunts across many years, and the mammoth skin, thick and tough and naturally insulated, served as windbreaks, roof coverings, door flaps, and ground covers. One mammoth could change a group's fortunes entirely. That is why they took the risk. And that is why the hunters who went in close, who put their bodies on the line, who drove spears into a 7-ton animal from arm's length, were so valued. They were not disposable. They were not expendable. They were the most important members of their community, and when they got hurt, the community took care of them. That is the circle. Hunting required courage. Courage led to injuries. Injuries required care. Care required community. Community required food. Food required hunting. Round and round for 300,000 years. Let me tell you about a site that most people have never heard of, but that absolutely changed how archaeologists think about Neanderthal hunting. It is a place called Cotte de Brelade on the island of Jersey in the English Channel. Except when Neanderthals used it, it was not an island at all. Sea levels were much lower during the Ice Age, and Jersey was connected to mainland Europe by dry land. Cotte is a massive cave, more like a ravine, cut into a granite headland, and at the base of this ravine, archaeologists found something extraordinary. Enormous piles of mammoth and woolly rhinoceros bones, not scattered, piled, concentrated in heaps at the base of the cliff directly below the cave opening, and the bone assemblages show a very specific pattern, mostly skulls and shoulder blades, the heavy parts, the parts that would be left behind after the good meat was stripped away and carried off. What does that tell us? It tells us that Neanderthals at Cotte were driving mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses off the edge of this headland, stampeding them toward the cliff, forcing them over, and then climbing down to butcher the fallen animals below. They did not need to get close. They did not need to thrust a spear into a mammoth's belly. They used gravity. The sheer height of the fall did the work, and they did this repeatedly over thousands of years. Layer upon layer of mammoth and rhinoceros bones, separated by sterile sediment, showing that groups came back to this exact spot again and again across many generations. That is strategic hunting on a landscape level. They identified a natural killing ground, a place where the terrain itself became the weapon, and they used it the same way their great-grandparents had used it, and their great-grandparents before them. This is inherited tactical knowledge. This is tradition preserved across millennia. And Cotte is not the only cliff-kill site. I mentioned Mauran earlier, in the French Pyrenees, with its 137 bison, but there are others. At sites across France, Spain, and Central Europe, archaeologists have found concentrations of animal bones at the bases of cliffs, in dead-end valleys, and at natural choke points in the landscape. Each one tells the same story. Neanderthals were not randomly encountering animals and attacking them wherever they found them. They were herding them, directing them, using noise, movement, and coordinated positioning to push animals toward places where the terrain gave the hunters an overwhelming advantage. And this is sophisticated behavior. This is planning. This is spatial reasoning. You need to understand how a herd of bison will react to a line of people moving toward them from the south. You need to know that the bison will run north. You need to know that if they run north, they will hit the ravine. You need to have people waiting at the ravine. You need to coordinate the timing so the drivers and the blockers are in position simultaneously. This is logistics. This is command and control, and they did it without language as complex as ours. Or at least that is what most researchers think, although that is a debate for another night. However they communicated, whether through gestures, simple vocalizations, or something more elaborate, it was enough to coordinate these complex, multi-stage hunting operations across difficult terrain with precision timing. Now, I want to take you somewhere different. Let us talk about the prey animals individually, because each one presented its own unique challenge, and the way Neanderthals adapted their approach to different species tells us a lot about their intelligence and flexibility. We already talked about mammoths and bison, but let me spend some time on horses, because horses were one of the most commonly hunted animals in the Neanderthal diet, and they are not easy prey. Wild horses in the Pleistocene were not like the domesticated horses you see in fields today. They were smaller, stockier, and incredibly alert. They had excellent vision, nearly 360 degrees of visual range. They could hear a twig snap from hundreds of yards away. They were fast, capable of sustained speeds that no human could match, and they travelled in herds with dominant stallions who were aggressive and protective. So how do you hunt an animal that can see you coming from almost any direction, hear you approaching from the next valley and outrun you without breaking a sweat? You use the one advantage you have: patience and knowledge, and the willingness to wait longer than any other predator on the landscape. Let me walk you through what a horse hunt probably looked like, because the details are worth knowing. Wild Pleistocene horses, often called tarpans by researchers, were smaller and stockier than modern domestic horses. They stood about 13 to 14 hands high, roughly 4.5 feet at the shoulder, and they weighed around 700 to 800 pounds. They were tough, compact animals bred by evolution for survival in harsh grassland environments. Their coats were thick, their hooves were hard, their temperaments were wary and alert, honed by hundreds of thousands of years of coexistence with predators far more dangerous than humans: wolves, cave lions, hyenas. These horses had been hunted by some of the most efficient predators in the animal kingdom for longer than Neanderthals had existed. They were not easy prey, but they had vulnerabilities. They needed water. Every day, usually twice a day, the herd would travel to a water source, a river bend, a spring, the edge of a lake, and these water sources were known, predictable. The same herd used the same drinking spots, following the same trails at roughly the same times, and Neanderthals, who lived in these landscapes for years, for generations, knew those patterns as well as the horses themselves knew them. Neanderthals were ambush predators when it came to horses. They would identify locations where horses came to drink, usually at river bends or at the edges of lakes where the bank forced the animals into a confined area. They would position themselves downwind, hidden behind natural cover, sometimes for hours, waiting for the herd to settle and begin drinking. When a horse drinks, it has to lower its head. Its field of vision narrows, its ears dip toward the water. For those few seconds, it is vulnerable, and that is when the hunters moved. Quick, coordinated, silent until the last possible moment, then explosive action. Multiple spears, multiple hunters, targeting a single animal before the rest of the herd could react and flee. The entire hunt might take less than a minute once the approach began. But the preparation, the positioning, the waiting, that took hours, maybe days, that is discipline, that is self-control, that is a level of behavioural sophistication that we rarely give Neanderthals credit for. And then there were the aurochs. If you have never heard of an aurochs, you are missing one of the most impressive animals that ever lived. The aurochs was the wild ancestor of modern domestic cattle, but calling an aurochs a cow is like calling a great white shark a goldfish. An adult male aurochs stood about 6 feet tall at the shoulder, some stood even taller. They weighed over 2,000 pounds. They had thick, muscular necks and massive forward-pointing horns that could be nearly 3 feet long. They were aggressive, territorial, and phenomenally strong. And unlike bison, which tended to flee when threatened, aurochs were known to stand their ground and fight. A cornered aurochs was one of the most dangerous animals in Pleistocene Europe. Historical accounts from the medieval period, when aurochs still survived in parts of Eastern Europe, describe them as fearless and violent. They would charge horses, gore hunting dogs, and attack humans without provocation. Julius Caesar himself wrote about them, saying that the Germanic tribes considered it a great feat to kill one, and that the hunters who brought in their horns were publicly honoured. That is the animal Neanderthals hunted routinely. Not occasionally, routinely. We find aurochs bones at dozens of Neanderthal campsites, always with the same pattern of cut marks and marrow extraction. They had figured out how to take these things down consistently, generation after generation. Reindeer are interesting for a completely different reason. Unlike the other animals we have talked about, reindeer are migratory. They move in enormous herds across vast distances, following seasonal patterns tied to vegetation growth and weather. In some parts of Ice Age Europe, reindeer herds numbered in the tens of thousands, and their annual migrations were as predictable as the seasons themselves. And Neanderthals knew those patterns. They knew when the reindeer would come. They knew which routes the herds would take. They knew which river crossings the herds would use, because reindeer almost always cross rivers at the same shallow points, year after year, generation after generation, and so Neanderthals would be waiting at those crossing points. A reindeer in water is slow, clumsy, vulnerable. Its legs are churning, its footing is uncertain, and it cannot change direction quickly. A hunter standing on the bank with a spear has an enormous advantage, and at some sites, archaeologists have found massive concentrations of reindeer bones at known river crossing points, indicating that Neanderthals used these ambush locations repeatedly, returning to the same spot every year when the migration came through. Think about the knowledge that requires. You need a mental calendar. You need to know, without written records, without clocks, without any of the external aids that we rely on, that the reindeer will arrive at this river crossing in approximately 2 weeks, based on the position of the sun, the temperature, the state of the vegetation, or whatever other cues they used, and then you need to travel to that location, set up, and be ready. That is planning on a timescale of weeks or months. That is long-term thinking. That is a cognitive capacity that goes far beyond simple reaction to immediate circumstances. And here is the wonderful part. Every generation taught the next. The elders who had seen 30 migrations pass through that river crossing taught the young hunters who were seeing it for the first or second time. The knowledge accumulated, grew richer, more detailed, where exactly to stand, how deep the water was at different points, which bank gave the best approach, where to process the kill afterward. This knowledge was the group's most valuable possession, more important than any spear or stone tool because without it, the tools were useless. You could make the finest Levallois point in history, but if you did not know where to find the animals, it did not matter. And that brings me to something I find fascinating, the question of how hunting knowledge was transmitted. Because we are talking about a species that, as far as we know, did not have fully modern language. They may have had some form of speech, the anatomy suggests it was possible, but their communication was almost certainly simpler than ours. So how did they teach the complex multi-step process of hunting to the next generation? The answer, most researchers believe, is that they taught by doing, by showing, by demonstrating, by taking young people along on hunts and letting them watch, then letting them participate gradually, starting with simple tasks and building toward more complex ones. We actually see evidence of this in the stone tool record. At some Neanderthal sites, archaeologists have found clusters of poorly made Levallois flakes alongside expertly made ones. The poorly made ones have all the characteristics of a beginner's attempt. Mistakes in the preparation of the core, strikes that missed the right angle, flakes that came out too thick or too thin. These are practice pieces, teaching moments. Someone, an experienced napper, sat down with someone less experienced and showed them how to do it, and the beginner tried, failed, tried again, and the evidence of their learning process is right there in the sediment 200,000 years later. And if they taught toolmaking this way, it is almost certain they taught hunting the same way. Bring the young ones along, let them watch how the experienced hunters read the landscape, track the animals, choose the ambush point, coordinate the approach. Let them carry spears on hunts, standing back at first, then moving closer as they gained skill and confidence. Every successful Neanderthal hunter was the product of years of apprenticeship, learning from people who had done it their whole lives, who had learned from people who had done it their whole lives before them. This chain of teaching stretches back thousands of generations, unbroken across hundreds of thousands of years. Let me tell you about one more aspect of Neanderthal hunting that deserves attention, and it is something that connects to their emotional and social lives in a way that the physical evidence alone cannot capture. Fire. Fire was absolutely central to the Neanderthal way of life, and it played a crucial role in the hunting process from start to finish. They used fire to harden spear tips, warming the wood and then scraping it to create a dense, hardened point. They used fire to produce birch bark tar for hafting. They used fire for light and warmth at camp while processing kills that came in late in the day. They used fire to cook meat, which is important because cooked meat delivers more usable calories than raw meat. The proteins break down during cooking, making them easier to digest, and the body spends less energy on the digestion process itself. There is actually a whole field of study built around this idea, called the cooking hypothesis, most famously championed by a primatologist named Richard Wrangham. His argument is that cooking was one of the most important innovations in human evolutionary history, more important than stone tools, more important than fire itself as a source of warmth, because of what it did to our ability to extract energy from food. And the evidence supports him. When you cook meat, the collagen in connective tissue breaks down into gelatin, which is much easier to chew and digest. The muscle fibers separate and soften, toxins and pathogens are destroyed, and your gut, which is an energy-hungry organ, does not have to work nearly as hard to process the food, which means more of the calories from that food are available for other things, like fueling an enormous brain, like keeping a massive muscular body warm in freezing temperatures, like recovering from the crushing injuries that hunting inflicted. So by cooking their food, Neanderthals were effectively increasing the caloric yield of every hunt. And there is something else about fire that I think matters enormously, even though we cannot prove it from the archaeological record. Fire was where the group gathered at the end of the day, after the hunt, after the butchering, after the carrying and the processing and the distributing. When all the work was done, they sat around the fire, and in that space, in the warmth and the light and the shared exhaustion, after a day of life-threatening effort, something happened that we can only imagine. Maybe they communicated about the hunt, gestured through the story of how it went, showed each other the close calls, pointed to their new scratches and dents. Maybe the children listened, wide-eyed, absorbing everything, learning without even knowing they were learning. Maybe the elders, the ones too old or too injured to hunt anymore, watched the young ones and remembered when they had been the ones carrying the spears. We cannot know. We will never know. But the fire pits are there, thousands of them, at every major Neanderthal site across Europe, and where there are fire pits, there were people sitting around them, together, after doing the hardest work imaginable. There is one more thing I want to mention before we start winding down, because it ties together everything we have talked about tonight. For a long time, the standard narrative was that Homo sapiens replaced Neanderthals because we were simply better hunters. We had projectile weapons, bows and atlatls, and thrown spears that allowed us to hunt from a distance. We were smarter, more innovative, more adaptable, and Neanderthals, with their crude thrusting spears and their brute force approach, simply could not compete. But that narrative is falling apart, and the reason it is falling apart is that the more we learn about Neanderthal hunting, the more we realize it was not crude at all. It was extraordinarily sophisticated, and it worked. For 300,000 years it worked. The close-range method was not a failure of imagination or intelligence. It was an adaptation, a highly successful one. Neanderthal bodies were built for close-range power. Their short, muscular limbs generated enormous force for spear thrusts. Their thick bones and heavy muscles absorbed impacts that would cripple a modern human. Their barrel chests provided the respiratory capacity for intense, sustained physical effort. Their entire anatomy was optimized for exactly the kind of hunting they did. And their stone tools, their Levallois points and scrapers and birch bark tar were perfectly suited to their needs. They did not need projectile weapons because their method worked without them. They did not need bows because they had something else: courage, strength, teamwork, and an intimate knowledge of their prey and their landscape that accumulated over thousands of generations. It is easy to look at history and see the Neanderthals as losers, the ones who got replaced, the evolutionary dead end. But that is lazy thinking. A species that thrived for 300,000 years across an entire continent, that developed a hunting system so effective it barely changed because it did not need to, that cared for its injured and past knowledge from generation to generation, and faced down the largest animals on Earth, armed with nothing but sharpened wood and stone. That species was not a failure. That species was remarkable. And their hunting, more than anything else, proves it. Now I want to go deeper into something that we touched on earlier but did not fully explore, the seasonal dimension of Neanderthal hunting. Because hunting was not the same activity in January as it was in July. The entire approach shifted with the seasons, and understanding that rhythm tells you how deeply Neanderthals understood their world. In winter, the challenges were obvious: short days, extreme cold, snow covering the ground, making travel difficult, many plant foods completely unavailable. But winter also had advantages for hunters. Animal tracks in snow are easy to follow. Fresh tracks tell you exactly how many animals passed, how recently, in what direction, and how fast they were moving. A skilled tracker reading tracks in snow has an enormous information advantage over one reading tracks in dry summer grass. And animals in winter are often weaker. They have been burning through their fat reserves for months. They are hungrier, which means they are more likely to be found in predictable locations, the sheltered valleys and south-facing slopes where vegetation persists longest. And they are slower. A bison pushing through knee-deep snow cannot run at full speed. A mammoth in deep snow burns enormous energy just walking. The cold that made life miserable for the hunters also worked in their favour by slowing and weakening their prey. We see this in the archaeological record. At many Neanderthal sites, the animal bones are dominated by species that were hunted in late autumn and winter. The growth rings on reindeer antlers, the development stage of horse teeth, the fat content analysis of bone marrow, all of these tell us that the heaviest hunting happened when the weather was worst. That makes sense. Winter was when they needed the calories most, and when the animals were most vulnerable. It was also when they had the fewest alternative food sources. Everything came down to the hunt. Summer hunting was different. The animals were stronger, faster, better fed, but they were also more widely dispersed across the landscape, which meant that smaller groups of hunters could go out on shorter, less risky expeditions. A summer hunt might involve just 3 or 4 hunters targeting a single horse or a young bison that had wandered from its herd. Less dramatic than a winter bison drive, but lower risk, and every successful small hunt added up. Summer was also when Neanderthals could take advantage of seasonal abundances. Rivers full of spawning fish, although the evidence for Neanderthal fishing is limited. Nesting bird colonies, marine resources along coastlines. At some sites in Gibraltar, at the very southern tip of Europe, Neanderthals were harvesting mussels and other shellfish, catching seals, and even taking birds like pigeons and raptors from cliffside nesting sites. These were not hunting in the traditional sense, but they were food acquisition strategies that supplemented the big game hunting that remained the core of their diet. The Gibraltar sites deserve their own moment, actually, because they are some of the most important Neanderthal sites in the world, and they tell us things about Neanderthal hunting and diet that we cannot learn anywhere else. Gorham's Cave and Vanguard Cave sit in the limestone cliffs of the eastern face of the Rock of Gibraltar, looking out over the Mediterranean. Neanderthals lived in these caves for over 100,000 years, from roughly 127,000 years ago to around 32,000 years ago, making Gibraltar one of the very last places Neanderthals survived on Earth. And the archaeological record in these caves is extraordinary. Thousands of animal bones, stone tools in every layer, fire pits, and a diet that was remarkably diverse. They ate red deer, ibex, rabbits, tortoises, birds, marine mammals like monk seals, dolphins that washed up on shore, mussels, limpets, and fish. That range of food sources tells us something important. Neanderthals were not rigid, one-trick hunters locked into a single strategy. They adapted. When big game was available, they hunted big game. When it was not, they shifted to whatever the environment provided. They were flexible, intelligent foragers who adjusted their behaviour to match their circumstances. That might not sound revolutionary, but it contradicts the old image of Neanderthals as specialised megafauna hunters who could not adapt when conditions changed. The Gibraltar evidence shows they absolutely could adapt. They did adapt. They exploited everything their environment offered, from 2-ton bison to tiny mussels. And they did it for 100,000 years in one location. Let me talk about something that most hunting discussions overlook entirely: water. Specifically, how Neanderthals used water features in their hunting strategies, beyond the river crossings we already discussed. Because water was not just a place to ambush drinking animals, it was a strategic element that shaped entire hunting territories. Rivers, lakes, marshes, and bogs all play different roles. rivers channeled animal movement. Large animals tend to follow river valleys when they migrate because the walking is easier along flat floodplains and because rivers provide water and grazing. Neanderthals, who controlled a stretch of river valley, controlled a major animal highway, and the evidence suggests they did exactly that. Many Neanderthal campsites are positioned along rivers at points where the valley narrows or where tributary streams create natural bottlenecks. These are ambush positions, places where animals moving along the river are forced into a confined space. The camp is not there because Neanderthals liked the view. It is there because the geography created a hunting opportunity. Marshes and bogs were different. A large animal that wandered into a boggy area could become trapped. Its enormous weight worked against it, pushing its legs deep into the soft ground while the lighter, more agile hunters could move across the surface or approach from solid ground at the edges. Several kill sites across northern Europe show evidence of this kind of bog hunting. Animals brought down in wet, soft terrain where their mobility was severely limited. It is a strategy that exploits simple physics. The heavier the animal, the more the soft ground works in the hunter's favour. And then there is ice. In deep winter, frozen lakes and rivers created yet another tactical opportunity. An animal on ice is in trouble. Its hooves, designed for grass and earth, have no grip on a frozen surface. It slips, it stumbles, it cannot turn quickly or accelerate. A Neanderthal in leather-wrapped feet, low to the ground, heavy and stable, had a real advantage on ice. We do not have direct archaeological evidence of ice hunting because ice does not preserve the kind of evidence we need, but the logic is sound, and ethnographic comparisons with modern Arctic hunters show that hunting animals on frozen water surfaces is a strategy that has been used by indigenous peoples worldwide for millennia. It would be surprising if Neanderthals, who lived in Ice Age conditions for hundreds of thousands of years, did not figure this out. Now, I want to address one of the most common questions people ask about Neanderthal hunting, and it is a question that actually reveals a lot about our own assumptions. The question is, were Neanderthals scavengers or hunters? Did they kill these animals themselves, or did they just find already dead animals and eat the leftovers? This question was taken seriously for decades, and some researchers argued strongly that Neanderthals were primarily scavengers, too slow and too stupid to hunt effectively, surviving on scraps left behind by more efficient predators like lions and hyenas. But the evidence has thoroughly demolished this idea, and I want to explain why, because the reasoning is beautiful in its simplicity. First, the cut marks. When a predator kills an animal, the predator eats certain parts first, usually the soft organs, the liver, the intestines, the tongue, then the large muscle groups on the legs and back. By the time a scavenger arrives, the best parts are gone. What is left is the bits the predator did not want: tendons, connective tissue, scraps of meat on the ribs and skull, and the cut marks on those scavenged bones look different from cut marks on freshly hunted bones. On a scavenged carcass, you find cut marks in odd places, on the edges of bones where someone was scraping for the last bits of meat. On a freshly hunted animal, you find cut marks in the prime locations: the upper limbs, the back, the shoulders, the places where the most and best meat sits. And Neanderthal cut marks are overwhelmingly in the prime locations. They were getting first access to fresh carcasses. They were the hunters, not the scavengers. Second, the marrow. Remember those thousands of spirally fractured long bones at Neanderthal sites? Fresh bone from a recently hunted animal fractures in a clean spiral when you hit it. Old bone from an animal that has been dead for days fractures differently because it has dried out. The fracture patterns at Neanderthal sites are almost entirely consistent with fresh bone. They were processing these animals shortly after they were hunted, not days later after finding a rotting carcass. Third, the stone tools embedded in bone. At several sites, stone points have been found lodged in animal bones, driven in with such force that they broke off and remained stuck. That is direct physical evidence of hunting. You do not need to stab a dead animal. The scavenging hypothesis is dead. Neanderthals were active, skilled, cooperative hunters. The evidence is overwhelming, and it comes from dozens of sites across multiple continents. They were apex predators, sitting at the very top of their food chain, and they earned that position through intelligence, skill, and extraordinary physical courage. When isotope analysis of Neanderthal bones was conducted in the early 2000s, the results confirmed what the cut marks and fracture patterns had already shown. Neanderthal nitrogen isotope values placed them squarely at the top of the food chain, at the same level as wolves and cave lions. They were not scavenging scraps from predators. They were the predators, competing with cave lions and hyenas for the same prey, and winning often enough to sustain their species for 300,000 years across an entire continent. I want to spend a few minutes on a topic that connects hunting to social structure, because I think it is one of the most important and least discussed aspects of Neanderthal life. Group size. Neanderthal groups were small. Genetic evidence, from analysing the diversity of mitochondrial DNA found at multi-individual sites, suggests that typical Neanderthal bands numbered between 15 and 25 individuals. That is tiny, and it has enormous implications for hunting. In a group of 20, maybe 10 are adults of hunting age. Of those 10, at any given time, 1 or 2 might be injured and unable to hunt. 1 might be in the late stages of pregnancy. 1 might be caring for a very young infant. So your actual hunting force might be 6 or 7 adults. 7 people, armed with wooden spears, going up against a 2,000-pound bison or a 7-ton mammoth. Every single hunter matters. Losing even 1 to injury is a significant blow to the group's ability to feed itself. And this is why the care for injured individuals makes so much sense from a survival perspective, not just an emotional one. An experienced hunter who's been injured is not worthless. He or she has decades of accumulated knowledge. They know where the animals go. They know the terrain. They know the techniques. Even if they cannot physically participate in the hunt, they can advise. They can help plan. They can teach the younger hunters. And if the injury heals, they can hunt again. Letting an experienced hunter die because they cannot contribute right now would be a terrible waste of irreplaceable knowledge and future capability. So the care was not just kindness, although I believe it was that too. It was also smart strategy, an investment in a valuable group member whose knowledge and skill could not be easily replaced. And this small group size affected hunting strategy in another way. Neanderthals could not afford mass casualties. If a hunting technique was too risky, if it regularly got hunters killed or seriously injured, it would be abandoned quickly because the group could not absorb the losses. So the techniques that survived, the ones that were passed down across thousands of generations, were the ones that balance risk against reward most effectively. The cliff drives, the bog traps, the river crossing ambushes, these were not reckless charges. They were calculated, risk-managed operations designed to minimize danger to the hunters while maximizing the chance of a successful kill. Every tactical innovation that reduced the risk of injury, using terrain as a weapon, targeting vulnerable moments when animals were drinking or crossing water, coordinating multiple hunters to divide the animal's attention, all of these served the same purpose. Keep the hunters alive, keep the group fed, keep the knowledge flowing forward. Let me tell you about tool maintenance, because it reveals something about Neanderthal psychology that I find deeply relatable. At many Neanderthal campsites, archaeologists find what they call resharpening flakes. These are tiny chips of stone that come off a tool when someone is restoring its edge. The tool has gotten dull from use, so the owner sits down and carefully removes small flakes from the cutting edge to make it sharp again. And the quantities of these resharpening flakes at some sites are enormous, thousands of them. What this tells us is that Neanderthals valued their tools, they maintained them. They did not just use a stone flake until it was dull, and then throw it away and make a new one. They sat down, probably by the fire at the end of the day, and carefully restored their tools to working condition. Think about what that is. That is a craftsman maintaining their equipment. That is a hunter inspecting their gear the night before a hunt. That is preparation, conscientiousness, pride in one's tools. It is such a human behaviour. You can almost see it. The firelight flickering, the quiet chip, chip, chip of stone on stone as someone works a blade back to sharpness, testing the edge with a thumb, turning it in the light, satisfied, setting it aside, picking up the next one. We do the same thing. A carpenter sharpens their chisels the night before a big job. A chef hones their knives before service. A soldier cleans their rifle before patrol. A surgeon checks their instruments before operating. The impulse is the same across all of them and across all of time. Respect the tools that keep you and the people who depend on you alive. Do not wait until the moment of need to discover that your edge is dull or your point is chipped. Prepare tonight for tomorrow's challenge. And in that firelit moment of quiet preparation, there is something almost meditative. The repetitive motion, the focus, the satisfaction of feeling the edge come back sharp and clean, ready for whatever tomorrow brings. Neanderthals experienced that. sitting in the warmth of their shelter, surrounded by the sounds of their family settling in for the night, running their thumbs along the edge of a stone tool they had carried for weeks, carefully restoring it to perfection. Take care of the things that keep you alive. Respect the tools of your trade, and Neanderthals did this 300,000 years ago, in firelit caves, preparing for tomorrow's hunt, the same way people prepare for tomorrow's work today. Some things about being human have not changed at all. There is something I've been saving for this part of the story, because I think it deserves its own space. The question of whether Neanderthals hunted at night. It sounds strange, but there is actually some reason to think about it. We know that many large prey animals, particularly horses and bison, are most active during the twilight hours, at dawn and dusk and sometimes through the night. These are the times when they graze most actively, when they move between water sources and feeding grounds. A predator that can operate during these low-light hours has access to prey when the animals are most exposed. Now, Neanderthals almost certainly could not see well in the dark. Their eyes were adapted for daylight like ours, but they had fire, and fire changes the equation. There is a fascinating hypothesis, not proven but compelling, that Neanderthals may have used fire as part of their hunting strategy during twilight and nighttime hunts. Not carrying torches while running after animals, that would be impractical, but possibly using fire to drive animals. A line of fires lit across a grassy plain would create a wall of light and heat that animals would instinctively move away from. If you place those fires carefully, you could direct the movement of a herd toward a predetermined killing ground, a cliff, a bog, a narrow valley where hunters were waiting. We know that later human populations used fire drives extensively. Aboriginal Australians used fire to manage entire landscapes and drive game. Plains Indians in North America used grass fires to direct bison herds. The technique is ancient and widespread. Whether Neanderthals used it is still debated, but they had all the necessary components. They controlled fire, they understood animal behaviour, they knew their landscapes intimately, and they were creative problem solvers who used every advantage the environment offered. It would be surprising if they never put fire and hunting together. Speaking of fire and hunting, let me share something about the post-hunt processing that we did not cover in enough detail earlier: cooking. Because cooking meat is not just a matter of taste or comfort. It is a survival strategy with enormous implications for caloric efficiency and health. When you eat raw meat, your body has to do a tremendous amount of work to break down the proteins and extract the nutrients. Your digestive system churns away for hours, burning calories just to process what you ate. Cooking does much of that work externally. Heat denatures proteins, breaking them down into smaller, more digestible components. It kills parasites and bacteria that could cause illness or intestinal infection, and it significantly increases the percentage of calories your body can actually absorb from the food. Some estimates suggest that cooking increases the usable caloric content of meat by 20 to 30%. For a Neanderthal who needs 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day, that difference is enormous. It is the difference between needing to hunt every third day versus every fourth day. Over a winter, that might mean 1 or 2 fewer hunts, which means less risk, fewer injuries, and more time for other activities like tool maintenance, hide processing, and teaching. We find fire pits at virtually every Neanderthal habitation site. They were not occasional fire users. They were constant fire users. Fire was as central to their survival as their spears and stone tools, and the remains found in those fire pits, charred animal bones, heat-cracked stones used for indirect cooking, fire-reddened sediment, tell us that cooking was a standard practice. Every major kill was cooked. The meat was almost certainly roasted directly over coals or on heated stones. Some researchers have even suggested that Neanderthals may have practiced a form of stone boiling, heating rocks in a fire, and then dropping them into a hide-lined pit filled with water to create a hot broth. The evidence for this is indirect, but the technique is so widespread among later hunter-gatherer cultures that it seems plausible. And there is another post-hunt practice that deserves mention: smoking and drying meat for storage. Now, this is controversial. Some researchers argue that Neanderthals did not practice food storage because they were immediate return foragers, eating what they caught and hunting again when they needed more. But others point to the sheer volume of animal bones at some sites as evidence that more meat was being brought in than could be eaten fresh. A single large bison could provide 500 pounds of meat. A group of 20 people, even eating 4,000 calories each per day, could not eat all of that before it spoiled. especially in summer when meat goes bad quickly. So either they were sharing with other groups, which is possible, or they were preserving some of it. Drying meat by hanging thin strips in the wind and sun, or in the smoke above a fire, is one of the simplest preservation techniques known. It requires no special technology, just knowledge and patience. And thin slices of meat cut with sharp stone tools would dry effectively within a few days. We may never be able to prove that Neanderthals dried or smoked meat, because the evidence would not survive in the archaeological record. But the logic is strong, and it would be consistent with everything else we know about their intelligence and practical problem-solving skills. I want to talk about one more dimension of hunting that I think is deeply important and rarely discussed: the emotional experience. What did it feel like? We can describe the techniques, the tools, the injuries, the strategies, but what was it like emotionally, psychologically, to be a Neanderthal hunter? Obviously, we can never know for certain. We cannot interview them. We cannot read their thoughts, but we can reason from what we know. First, fear. Any honest hunter will tell you that facing a large, dangerous animal at close range is terrifying. Your body floods with adrenaline. Your hands shake. Your vision narrows. Your mouth goes dry. Every instinct screams at you to run, and Neanderthals experienced all of this. They had the same basic neurochemistry we do, the same fight or flight response, the same adrenaline system. When a Neanderthal stood 10 feet from a steppe bison with a spear in hand, their body was screaming at them to get away, and they overrode that instinct. They stepped forward anyway. That is not the absence of fear. That is courage in the purest, most ancient sense of the word. The ability to feel the fear and act despite it. And they did this over and over throughout their entire lives. From the first hunt they participated in as teenagers to the last hunt before injury or age finally stopped them. Decades of deliberately walking toward the thing that terrified them, because their family was hungry and there was no one else to do it. Then there is the bond with fellow hunters. When your life depends on the person next to you, when you know that if you falter they will be exposed, and if they falter you will be exposed, a bond forms that goes beyond friendship, beyond family even. It is the bond of people who have faced mortal danger together and survived. Military veterans describe this. Firefighters describe it. It is one of the most intense forms of human connection that exists, and Neanderthal hunters experienced it every time they went out. Every hunt was a shared risk, a shared effort, a shared triumph, or a shared failure. And those experiences, accumulated over years and decades of hunting together, must have created relationships of extraordinary depth and trust. We cannot see that in the bones. We cannot see it in the stone tools or the cut marks or the fire pits. But it was there. It had to be there, because the hunting system could not work without it. And then there is the relationship with the prey itself. This might sound strange to modern ears, but virtually every indigenous hunting culture that has ever been studied expresses a deep, complex relationship with the animals they hunt. Respect, gratitude, even something approaching love, not sentimentality, not the kind of attachment we feel toward pets, something different, a recognition that the animal's life is being taken so that the hunter's family can live, a sense of reciprocity, of debt, of connection across species. We see this in every documented hunting culture. The Inuit offer fresh water to the seal they have just caught, believing that the seal gave its life willingly and deserves respect. Plains Indians pray to the spirit of the bison. San hunters in the Kalahari apologize to the eland before the final kill. These are not rituals performed by primitive people. They are expressions of a deep psychological and spiritual relationship between hunter and prey that seems to emerge naturally whenever human beings depend on animals for their survival. Did Neanderthals feel something similar? We will never know. But they were intelligent, emotional, social beings who depended completely on these animals for their survival. They knew these animals intimately, watched them, tracked them, studied their habits across generations. It is hard to imagine that level of intimacy and dependence without some kind of emotional or psychological response. Maybe they did not have rituals. Maybe they did not articulate it in words, but something was there. Some recognition that the mammoth was not just meat, that the bison was not just calories, that these were living things whose lives were intertwined with theirs in the most fundamental way possible. Let me share one final piece of evidence before we wind down, because it is one of my favourites and it captures everything we have been talking about in a single image. At a site called Biache-Saint-Vaast in northern France, archaeologists found a Neanderthal processing site dated to around 200,000 years ago. In one layer, they found the remains of at least 5 individual aurochs and 2 rhinoceroses, along with thousands of stone tools and resharpening flakes. The bones showed extensive cut marks in all the right places, systematic butchering by experienced hands. Marrow had been extracted from every available long bone. The stone tools had been made on site, using local flint with Levallois technique, and the whole assemblage was concentrated in a relatively small area, suggesting that the processing happened in one spot, probably over a few days, probably by a single group. Picture what happened there. 200,000 years ago, on a riverside plain in northern France, a group of Neanderthals, maybe 15 or 20 individuals, carried out a series of successful hunts. They brought down multiple aurochs and at least 2 rhinoceroses, enormous, dangerous animals. They butchered them systematically. They extracted every available calorie. They maintained their tools throughout the process. And then they packed up and moved on, leaving behind a thin layer of bones, flint chips, and evidence of fire that would lie buried in the earth for 2,000 centuries before anyone found it. Those people had no idea that their trash heap would one day be excavated by people in white gloves, using dental picks and GPS coordinates. They had no idea that anyone would ever know or care about what they did that week on the riverbank. They were just living, just hunting, just feeding their families the only way they knew how. And yet here we are, 200,000 years later, telling their story, marvelling at their skill, respecting their courage, learning from their lives. That is the power of what they left behind. Not monuments, not written records, not grand achievements designed to be remembered. Just the quiet evidence of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, bones and stones and ashes, and a story that, once you hear it, you never forget. I want to bring it all together. Everything we have talked about tonight, the weapons, the techniques, the injuries, the care, the intelligence, the courage, all of it points to the same conclusion. Neanderthal hunting was not a primitive activity performed by primitive people. It was one of the most sophisticated and demanding survival systems ever developed by any species on this planet. It required physical courage that most modern humans would find incomprehensible. Walking up to a woolly mammoth with a wooden stick, driving a spear between the ribs of an elephant at arm's length, standing your ground while a 2,000-pound bison thrashes and kicks after being speared. These are things that required a kind of bravery that goes beyond anything we are typically asked to do. It required intelligence, reading landscapes, understanding animal behaviour, planning ambushes days in advance, coordinating multiple hunters across difficult terrain, making tools with techniques that required visualization, planning, and motor skills comparable to modern skilled trades. It required social bonds deeper than we can easily measure from the archaeological record. The trust between hunters who depended on each other with their lives, the care given to injured members who could not contribute, the teaching of skills from one generation to the next, patiently, carefully, knowing that the survival of everyone depended on the quality of that teaching. And it required endurance. Not just physical endurance, although that was extraordinary, but the endurance of will, of commitment, of waking up every morning for your entire life, knowing that today, again, you might have to put your body on the line against an animal that could end you with a single kick or a sweep of its tusks, and doing it anyway. Because that was the deal. That was the contract between you and your group. You hunt, they eat. They hunt, you eat. Everyone takes the risk. Everyone shares the reward. That was the Neanderthal way. Now I want to expand on something we mentioned briefly earlier, but that really deserves a fuller treatment. The comparative question, how did Neanderthal hunting compare to early Homo sapiens hunting? Because this comparison is not just academically interesting. It goes to the heart of why Neanderthals disappeared and we survived. And the answer is more nuanced than most people think. When Homo sapiens arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago, they brought a different hunting toolkit. They had projectile weapons, thrown spears, spear throwers called atlatls that multiplied the force of a throw, and eventually bows and arrows. These weapons allowed them to engage large animals from a distance of 20, 30, even 50 yards. That is a massive tactical advantage, A hunter who can strike from 50 yards away is vastly safer than one who has to be within arm's length. Fewer injuries, fewer deaths, more hunters surviving to hunt another day, and Homo sapiens groups were larger. Their social networks were more extensive. They traded materials and tools across hundreds of miles, which gave them access to resources and information that Neanderthals, with their smaller, more isolated groups, did not have. But here is what is interesting. The Neanderthal method was not inherently inferior, it was different. And for the environment they evolved in, for the specific ecological niche they occupied, it worked extraordinarily well. Neanderthal bodies were optimized for close-range power. Homo sapiens bodies were optimized for distance throwing and endurance running. Neither design is better in absolute terms. They're adapted to different strategies. The Neanderthal approach was higher risk per individual hunt, but also higher reward, because a thrusting spear driven deep into an animal's chest with the full force of a Neanderthal's muscular frame was devastating. A single well-placed thrust could reach the heart or lungs. A thrown spear, even from an atlatl, might not penetrate as deeply, because the force is generated mechanically rather than by the full body weight of the thrower. So Neanderthals may have actually had a higher kill rate per engagement. They just paid for it with more injuries. And the key difference, the thing that ultimately tipped the scales, was probably not the hunting technique itself, but the social structure around it. Homo sapiens had larger groups, which meant more hunters, which meant they could absorb losses more easily. They had wider trade networks, which meant access to better raw materials for tools, and they had symbolic culture, art, ornaments, ritual, which seems to have strengthened social bonds and facilitated cooperation between groups in ways that Neanderthals may not have matched. The hunting itself was not the problem. The system around the hunting was what gave Homo sapiens the edge. And even then, the transition took thousands of years. Neanderthals did not disappear overnight. They coexisted with Homo sapiens in Europe for at least 5,000 years, possibly longer. That is a long time for a supposedly inferior species to hold on. It suggests that the competition was not lopsided. It was close, much closer than the traditional narrative implies. Let me tell you about something that brings a different dimension to the hunting story. Children. Specifically, how children learn to hunt. Because this is where the future of the entire species was decided, in the gap between the experienced hunters and the children who would one day replace them. Neanderthal children grew up fast. Dental studies show that their teeth developed more quickly than modern human children's teeth, suggesting that their overall physical development was accelerated. They may have reached physical maturity several years earlier than we do, but even so, a 10-year-old Neanderthal was not ready to drive a spear into a bison. They needed to learn, and that learning was a gradual process that probably spanned years. The stone tool evidence gives us a window into this. At many sites, archaeologists have identified what they call apprentice pieces, Levallois cores that were prepared incorrectly, flakes that came out wrong, platforms that were struck at the wrong angle. These mistakes sit alongside expertly made tools, and the most logical explanation is that experienced toolmakers were teaching less experienced ones. Young people learning the craft, making mistakes, trying again. And the distribution of these apprentice pieces at some sites is interesting. They tend to cluster in specific areas of the camp, slightly apart from the main activity zones. As if the teaching happened in a dedicated space. A classroom, if you will. A place where the master sat with the student and demonstrated the technique, step by step, while the student practiced on their own piece of flint. If they taught toolmaking this way, they certainly taught hunting the same way. A young person would have started with observation, watching the adults prepare for a hunt, watching them nap tools, harden spear tips, check the wind, read tracks, then small tasks, carrying equipment, fetching water, helping process a kill after the fact, then gradually more involvement, joining the tracking party, helping with the drive, making noise to push animals toward the ambush point, and finally one day holding a spear for real, standing in line with the adults, approaching the animal, making the thrust. Under the watchful eyes of experienced hunters who positioned the youngster carefully, gave them the safest spot in the line, and were ready to step in if something went wrong. This is apprenticeship. This is mentoring. This is the systematic transmission of survival knowledge from one generation to the next, and it worked for 300,000 years. There is one specific site I want to tell you about that gives us a rare glimpse into the very end of Neanderthal hunting, and it is hauntingly beautiful. It is a site in southern Spain called Gorham's Cave, one of the Gibraltar caves I mentioned earlier. In the upper layers of Gorham's Cave, dating to between 33 and 30,000 years ago, we find the last traces of Neanderthal occupation in this part of the world. The stone tools are still there, still Levallois, still competently made. The animal bones are still there, red deer, ibex, rabbits, shellfish from the nearby coast. The fire pits are still there, blackened soil and charred wood and heat-cracked stones. Everything looks normal, a Neanderthal camp functioning the way Neanderthal camps had always functioned. But the bones tell a different story when you look more closely. The proportion of the large game is lower than in earlier layers. More rabbits, more shellfish, fewer deer. The big animals were getting harder to find. The populations were thinning, climate was shifting, and Homo sapiens were moving into the region from the north, competing for the same resources. The Gorham's Cave Neanderthals were still hunting, still using the same techniques their ancestors had used for thousands of generations, still sitting around fires, still making tools, still feeding their children. But the world was closing in around them. The herds were smaller, the hunting grounds were shrinking. The group itself was probably smaller than it had been 1,000 years earlier, maybe just a handful of families clinging to the southern edge of Europe, the last warm corner of a cooling world, and sometime around 32,000 years ago they stopped coming to the cave. The layers go quiet, the tools stop, the fires go dark. Nobody knows exactly what happened to the last Neanderthals at Gibraltar. They may have simply dwindled until the group could no longer sustain itself. Too few hunters, too few children. The knowledge chain finally breaking after 300,000 years of unbroken transmission. Or they may have been absorbed into incoming Homo sapiens populations, their genes mixing with ours, which is exactly what the DNA evidence tells us happened in many places. Either way, the cave that had sheltered them for 100,000 years was empty. And it stayed empty until archaeologists arrived with their trowels and brushes hundreds of centuries later and began to read the story written in the sediment. The thing that stays with me, the thing I think about late at night when I am putting together these stories, is the continuity of it all. 300,000 years. Think about how long that is. The entire history of civilization, from the first cities in Mesopotamia to this moment right now, is about 5,000 years. The entire history of agriculture is 12,000 years. Neanderthals maintained their hunting tradition for 25 times longer than agriculture has existed. 60 times longer than civilization. That is a depth of time that is almost impossible to comprehend. And throughout that entire span, the basic pattern held. Small groups, close-range hunting, stone tools, fire, shared meat, care for the injured. Knowledge passed from parent to child. The details changed, of course. Tool styles evolved slowly over time. Different regions had slightly different approaches. Some groups specialized in reindeer, others in bison, others in horses, depending on what the local environment provided. But the core of it, the essential Neanderthal way of hunting and living, remained remarkably stable. And there is something admirable about that. We live in a world that celebrates disruption, innovation, constant change. We measure success by how quickly things improve. By that standard, the Neanderthals look static, stagnant even. But by another standard, the standard of sustainability, of long-term success, of living within the limits of your environment without destroying it, they were the most successful humans who ever lived. They found a system that worked, and they maintained it for longer than any other human culture has maintained anything. That is not stagnation. That is mastery. That is a species so perfectly adapted to its world that change was not necessary. And when the world finally changed beyond what their system could handle, it was not because they failed. It was because the world moved on without them. The ice retreated. The megafauna declined. A new species arrived with new tricks. And the old way, the 300,000-year way, the brave and brilliant and heartbreaking way, came to its end. But it left traces. In the DNA inside your cells, if you carry Neanderthal ancestry. In the tools buried in the soil. In the bones, broken and healed, that tell us how much they risked and how much they cared. In stories like this one told in the dark to help you sleep. Before we get to the very end, I want to tell you about a few more specific hunting sites, because each one adds another dimension to this story, and I think you will find them as fascinating as I do. There is a site called Salzgitter Lebenstätte in northern Germany, dated to about 58,000 years ago. It is a reindeer hunting camp, one of the most informative we have ever found. The Neanderthals at Salzgitter killed at least 86 reindeer at this one location. 86. And the age profiles of those reindeer tell us something remarkable. The vast majority were prime-age adults, between 2 and 7 years old. Not calves, not elderly animals. The healthiest, strongest, most nutritious individuals in the herd. That kind of selective hunting is not random. You do not accidentally kill 86 prime-age adults, while randomly picking off whatever crosses your path. You do that by targeting specific animals within a herd, choosing the ones that will provide the most meat and the best hides, and letting the young and old ones go. That is resource management. That is sustainable harvesting. That is an understanding, whether conscious or intuitive, that if you leave the breeding females and the young, the herd will recover and be there again next year. It is the same principle that modern wildlife managers use today, and Neanderthals were doing it 58,000 years ago. Then there is a site called Taubach in central Germany, which is about 120,000 years old. Taubach is unusual because the main prey species there is not bison or horse or mammoth. It is straight-tusked elephant and rhinoceros. And the really interesting thing about Taubach is the environment. 120,000 years ago, this part of Germany was experiencing a warm interglacial period. The landscape was forested, warm, almost Mediterranean in character, and the hunting strategy was completely different from what we see at cold period sites. No cliff drives, no open plain ambushes. Instead, the evidence suggests individual or small groups stalking in dense forest, getting close to large animals using the tree cover as concealment. A completely different approach for a completely different environment. Same species, same basic technology, but an entirely different tactical application. That is flexibility. That is adaptability. That is intelligence applied to changing circumstances. And it demolishes the idea that Neanderthals were rigid, one-strategy hunters who could not adjust to new conditions. They adjusted constantly. When the environment was open steppe, they used open steppe techniques. When it was dense forest, they used forest techniques. When it was coastal, they harvested marine resources. The strategy changed, the skill remained. And I need to tell you about Schoningen once more, because we mentioned the famous spears earlier, but there is something else at that site that most people do not know about. Along with the spears, archaeologists found a smaller object, a double-pointed throwing stick, about 15 inches long, carefully shaped from spruce wood. It is the oldest known throwing stick in the world, 300,000 years old, and it tells us that the Neanderthal hunting toolkit was more diverse than we ever realized. A throwing stick is not a spear. You do not throw it at a mammoth, you throw it at smaller, faster prey. Birds, hares, small deer, animals that are too quick to approach with a thrusting spear but can be stunned or knocked down by a well-aimed throw from 20 or 30 feet away. The existence of this throwing stick means that Neanderthals were not exclusively big-game hunters. They had weapons specifically designed for small game as well. They were versatile. Their toolkit covered the full range of hunting scenarios they might encounter. And the throwing stick, like the spears found alongside it, is beautifully made, symmetrical, balanced. The weight distribution is even, which means it would fly straight and true. Somebody 300,000 years ago carved this thing with the same care and attention to physics that they applied to their full-size spears. Every tool was made with purpose and precision. Nothing was slapped together. Nothing was good enough. Everything was made right. There is one more site I want to mention, and then we will settle in for the closing. A place called Abric Romani, near Barcelona in northeast Spain. It is a rock shelter that was used by Neanderthals repeatedly over a span of about 50,000 years, from roughly 70,000 to about 40,000 years ago. What makes Abric Romani special is the incredible preservation. Because the shelter has a limestone overhang that continually deposited thin layers of calcium carbonate, like natural plaster, the occupation floors were sealed and preserved in exquisite detail. Each occupation layer is like a snapshot of a few days or weeks of Neanderthal life frozen in time, and what those snapshots show is extraordinary. Distinct activity areas within the shelter, hearths with associated cooking debris, butchering zones with concentrations of animal bones and stone tools, sleeping areas with minimal debris, just the impressions of bodies in soft sediment. and tool-making stations where piles of napping debris show exactly where someone sat and worked. Each layer tells the same story. A group arrives, they light a fire, they process their kills, they eat, they sleep, they make and repair tools, they leave, and then, years or decades later, another group comes and does the same thing in the same place. For 50,000 years. That is 2,000 human generations using the same rock shelter in the same way, hunting the same animals, using the same techniques, sitting around fires in the same spots. It is continuity on a scale that makes our entire recorded history look like a footnote. The animal bones at Abric Romani are mostly horse and deer, with some aurochs and ibex. The cut marks show expert butchering. The marrow extraction is systematic. The stone tools are classic Mousterian, the broader stone tool tradition that encompasses Levallois technique. And there is evidence that they organised their space deliberately. The butchering happened in one area, the cooking in another, the sleeping in another, tool-making in another. That is spatial organisation. That is planning. That's a group that has a system for how to use their living space efficiently. And that system was maintained across dozens of occupation episodes spanning tens of thousands of years. Think about your own home. You have a kitchen, a bedroom, a workspace. You organise your living space to match your activities. Neanderthals did the same thing 50,000 years ago under a rock shelter in Spain. The details are different. The impulse is identical. I realise I have not said enough about one of the most important prey animals, and I want to correct that before we close, the ibex. If you're not familiar with the ibex, it is a species of wild mountain goat with enormous curved horns, incredible agility, and a tendency to live in the most inaccessible terrain imaginable. Cliffs, ridges, mountain peaks, places where one wrong step means a fall of hundreds of feet. Hunting ibex is considered one of the most challenging forms of hunting that exists even today, with modern rifles and scopes and GPS and helicopters. And Neanderthals hunted them with stone-tipped spears in mountainous terrain without any of those aids. Sites in southern France, Spain, Italy and the Zagros Mountains of Iraq all show ibex hunting by Neanderthals, and the techniques must have been remarkable. You cannot drive an ibex off a cliff. They are the ones who live on cliffs. You cannot chase them across open ground. They are faster and more agile than any human on rough terrain. You have to ambush them. Find the trails they use between grazing areas and water sources. Position yourself along those trails, hidden, silent, patient, and strike when one passes close enough, in mountainous terrain, on narrow ledges, where a misstep by the hunter could be fatal even without the ibex being dangerous. This is hunting that requires not just courage and skill, but extraordinary physical fitness and mountaineering ability. And Neanderthals did it routinely, at sites across southern Europe and the Middle East, for tens of thousands of years. The ibex is a perfect example of why the old stereotype of Neanderthals as brainless brutes is so absurd. You do not hunt mountain goats on cliff faces with stone tools by being stupid. You do it by being smart, by being patient, by being observant, by being physically extraordinary, and by being brave in a very specific way, the quiet, patient kind of bravery that does not look dramatic from the outside, but requires absolute control over your body and your fear while you crouch motionless on a narrow ledge, waiting for an animal to walk past close enough to touch. That is the Neanderthal hunter, not a roaring caveman charging mindlessly at a mammoth. A careful, calculating, courageous person who read the landscape, understood the animals, made precise tools and risked everything for the people who depended on them, every single day. As we wind down tonight, I want to leave you with one last image, and I want to take my time with it, because I think it captures everything we have talked about in the last 2 hours. It is late afternoon on a frozen plain in what is now France, about 50,000 years ago. The light is golden and low, that particular quality of winter sunlight that turns everything amber and stretches long shadows across the snow. A group of Neanderthals is walking back toward their shelter, a limestone overhang facing south to catch whatever warmth the winter sun can give. They are moving slowly, they are exhausted, their bodies are heavy with the effort of the day, and they are carrying heavy loads. Cuts of bison meat wrapped in fresh hide and slung over broad shoulders. Long bones full of marrow carried under arms, a rolled bison skin for clothing or bedding, balanced on the back of the strongest member of the group. One of them is limping, a fresh bruise spreading across his shoulder and down his arm where the bison caught him with a kick just before it went down. He winces with each step but does not stop. The person next to him has shifted their own load to one side so they can walk close, ready to steady him if he stumbles. They have been hunting together for 20 years. There are no words needed. Another hunter, a woman, is walking at the back of the group, scanning behind them out of habit. She has a stone flake tucked into the folds of her furs and a short spear in her free hand. She has done this walk 100 times, the return from the hunt, the long tired walk home with the weight of survival on her back. She knows every rock, every dip in the terrain, every spot where the ground gets icy. She learned this path from her mother, who learned it from her mother before her. Some things do not need to be taught with words, they are learned with feet. Ahead of them, the shelter comes into view. A limestone overhang, broad and deep, with a natural windbreak on the western side that blocks the worst of the winter gusts. And at the entrance, a fire. Someone kept it going all day while the hunters were out, feeding it with dry wood, broken branches, and the occasional handful of dried horse dung which burns slowly and gives good heat. The smoke rises straight up in the still evening air, a thin grey column against the darkening sky. Children are watching from the edge of the overhang, 3 of them, crouched on a flat rock peering out at the approaching figures. They have been watching since the light started to change, waiting for the hunters to come home. They do this every time, and every time there is the same moment of relief when the dark shapes appear on the horizon and start to grow larger. They are coming. They are alive. They have food. An old man sits near the fire. His right arm hangs at an angle that says it was broken once, badly, and healed, crooked. He cannot hunt anymore and has not hunted in 3 or 4 years. But he was there when they planned this morning's approach. He was the one who suggested the narrow draw where the hillsides close in and the bison cannot run at full speed. He has seen 100 hunts in that draw. He knows every advantage it offers and every danger it hides. His body may be broken, but his mind holds knowledge that cannot be replaced, and everyone in the group knows it. He watches the hunters approach with an expression that might be pride, might be memory, might be both. They arrive. The loads come down. Heavy bundles of meat and bone land on the packed earth near the fire with dull thuds. Shoulders roll, backs straighten. Somebody exhales a long, shuddering breath, the kind that comes when the effort is finally over and the body lets go of the tension it has been carrying all day. An older woman with grey hair tied back and weathered hands produces scraping stones from a leather wrap. The hide work will start tomorrow, but she inspects the bison skin now, checking the quality, planning where to make the first cuts. She has been processing hides since she was a girl. Her scraping stones are worn smooth from decades of use. She runs a thumb along the edge of one, frowns slightly, sets it aside for resharpening. Someone cracks a long bone. One clean strike with a round hammerstone, and the bone splits with a sound like a branch breaking. Warm marrow gleams inside, a thick, fatty, golden substance that is one of the most calorie-dense foods in the natural world. The hunter scoops a handful out with 2 fingers and offers it to the smallest child, who takes it with both hands and eats it with an intensity that says she's been hungry all day. The hunter watches her eat, and something crosses his face that needs no translation across 50,000 years of time. That look, that quiet satisfaction of feeding someone you love with something you risked your life to bring home. We know that look. We have always known that look. The fire crackles and pops. The wind picks up outside the shelter, carrying a sound like distant waves, the wind moving across miles of frozen grassland with nothing to stop it. But inside the overhang, the fire pushes back the cold. The stone walls hold the heat. Bodies move closer together, furs are pulled over shoulders, the children settle between the adults, small shapes pressed against larger ones, seeking warmth and safety and the quiet reassurance of proximity. This is the oldest form of comfort. Being near the people who protect you. Being warm when the world outside is cold. The light fades, the fire paints shifting patterns on the rough stone walls, amber and orange and deep shadow. Stars appear above the plain, impossibly bright in air that has never known a city's light. The same stars that you can see tonight, if you're somewhere dark enough. The same constellations, the same slow wheel of light turning above a sleeping world. Tomorrow they might have to do it all again. Another hunt, another risk, another walk into the frozen landscape to face down an animal that could end any one of their lives with a single kick, a single sweep of a horn. But that is tomorrow, and tomorrow will come regardless. Tonight they rest. Tonight everyone eats. Tonight they are together, and that is enough. It has always been enough. The hunters lean against the stone wall, their bruised bodies heavy, their hands still smelling of birch bark tar and animal fat and cold earth. The old man with the crooked arm feeds another stick to the fire and watches the sparks rise. The children sleep. The wind howls, but the fire holds, and in the morning it starts again. 300,000 years of mornings, each one beginning the same way. Get up, check the wind, read the landscape, find the herd, pick up the spear, walk out into the cold, face the animal, come home, or do not. That was the deal. That was the life. And they chose it every day because the people waiting by the fire were worth it. If you are still with me, thank you for spending tonight here. This was a long one, and it meant a lot to me to tell this story the way it deserves to be told. If you made it this far, you are one of us. And if this helped you relax or learn something you did not know or drift off to sleep in the best possible way, that is exactly why I make these. So if you have not already, maybe consider subscribing to the channel. Every new subscriber helps me keep making these deep dives into the stories that history forgot. Drop a comment too if you feel like it. I love reading where everyone is listening from. All right, that is it for tonight. Tomorrow there will be something new waiting for you. Same voice, same pace. Another story from the deep past told in the dark just for you. Good night.